Hello there. I'm Steve Balch, Director of Texas Tech's Institute for the Study of Western Civilization in Lubbock, Texas. And today we're doing something unusual, a three-way, actually a four-way video interview with a distinguished American architect and academic, co-sponsored with the Petrarch Institute, which is an online resource for classical education, and hence has interests rather consonant with that of the Institute for the Study of Western Civilization. So before we go forward and before I introduce our guest, let me introduce my two collaborators on our interview panel who represent the Petrarch Institute. One, why don't you wave so that people can see you?
Hello.
One is Dr. Alexander Rosenthal-Pabul, who is one of the joint founders of the Petrarch Institute. He has a bachelor's degree from Princeton and a PhD from the Catholic University in Louvain. He is currently a lecturer at Johns Hopkins University, and he lives, that's an online lectureship, he lives in San Juan de Compostela in Spain. It's a very international program. The second person is Dr. Miles Smith, also a co-founder, hi there, of Petrarch. He has a BA in philosophy from McGill University, and I think in art as well, and also a PhD from Catholic University in Louvain, and works as a strategy consultant and director of corporate strategy in, I guess, the Toronto area in Canada. Our guest, the center of attention, is Professor Duncan G. Stroik of Notre Dame University, where he teaches architecture. He has a BA from the University of Virginia, a master's degree from the Yale School of Architecture. He is a practicing architect who specializes in Roman Catholic sacred architecture. And he has a variety of very memorable, you could see them on his Wikipedia page, buildings to his credit, including the Thomas Aquinas College Chapel, rather recently, and the Hillsdale College Chapel as well. He's won numerous awards, including the Arthur Ross Award and the Clem Labine Award, which I originally thought was for, as an old Brooklyn Dodger fan, was for relief pitching, but it's for architecture. And he is the editor of the journal, the Sacred Architecture Journal. So please have our thanks, Professor Stroik, for joining us today.
Great to be here. Thank you.
And let me lead off by asking how you came to be interested in pursuing a career as a sacred architect in the first place.
Doesn't everybody want to be a sacred architect? So I grew up in a home that was, parents loved the arts. My father was an architect. My mother studied art. And so from a young age, I didn't have a choice about what I was going to study. And I did study architecture at Virginia, fell in love with Jefferson and learned a lot from his teacher, Palladio. And then I went to Yale, where they tried to undo all of that, but I stuck to my guns. And no, it's the belief of many generations, many societies, that the temple has been the greatest of our building types. And so for me, the temple or the church is the highest form of architecture, and I've always wanted to do that. And I've been fortunate that some people have been willing to spend a lot of money and let me try to do that.
The theme of our panel discussion is architecture and plague, timely. And to start our discussion along those lines, let me open the floor to Alexander Rosenthal-Paboul, who can ask a question of his own.
Okay, Professor Stroik, I mean, I think we are all thinking quite a bit about the whole idea of plagues and pandemics right now. It's something which, you know, in terms of its impacts on our society, we are feeling perhaps more strongly than many people have in their whole lifetime. But of course, the whole issue of plagues is something quite perennial in human history. And obviously, the religious dimension has been tremendously important in human history. So I was wondering, I mean, what I think of right now that's peculiar about the church is the fact that so many of them are not having mass right now. But I'm wondering if you could give us a little bit of historical perspective on the role of the church historically during plagues. And since your specialization is architecture, maybe if you could say a little bit about plague churches and what motivated the construction of churches after a plague, and if there were any, you know, design elements that were distinctive about them, or anything like that that you would like to expound upon.
Thank you, Alex. So you're right. Plagues have been a part of our thousands of year history, and we've dealt with them, and especially religion and religious people have tried to deal with it, and different interpretations of what the plague might mean, but certainly how to respond to it has been consistent, to implore God for forgiveness, to implore God for healing, to as well to take care of those who are sick or are dying. And one of the things that comes to mind when we think of cities is the tradition of processions, and going through the city in procession as a group, and maybe with an image, a statue, a holy icon, or the Blessed Sacrament, that people would, one of the responses to all the death and the sickness was to process, and usually from one church to another. In a city like Rome, it would be perhaps from St. Mary Major, where there's a famous icon, a famous image of the Theotokos of Mary and Madonna and Child, and process to St. Peter's and then back, or in Venice to process from the Ducal Chapel, St. Mark, San Marco, to another place. And so the people participating in kind of asking God to cleanse or heal the city that they're walking through, kind of asking for blessings on the whole city. So it's very architectural, but it tends to be outside, and it tends to be associated with the exterior buildings and with these images, these holy images that would be held by the priest or by others that we are following, and the images of a saint or of Christ. So we're following them in the procession of healing.
Miles?
Thanks very much, Professor Stroik, for joining us. I mean, I think I'm being tempted to ask kind of broad background question about how you see the current moment either extending or aligning with trends to recovery of classical art or sacred art in the public view, in the public square, that might have been in motion before the sort of Wuhan epidemic hit. For example, I know that architects like Leon Krier have been talking about recovering a clear sense of the value of utilitarian buildings in one part of the public space or public grid, and sacramental public devotional buildings as a sort of complement to that. Not too many decades ago, I think banks used to like to borrow both a sense of the classical and the sacred by having a kind of temple style design to suggest both solidity and reliability. And so I don't know whether, especially I think in the United States, where there's a question about whether the classical vocabulary could be reintroduced in the public mall area, you know, for federal buildings, whether you see, I don't want to call it an opportunity, but a likelihood of this kind of recovering the literacy of public spirit in a time of plague, touching trends that were emerging otherwise, either in reviving the classical canon, or also crossing over the divide that's been enforced a little bit between merely public useful buildings and public sacramental buildings.
I think that's an excellent point, Miles. And I think this is a great opportunity. Whenever there's a catastrophe, it's an opportunity for us to either wallow in sadness or lethargy, or to try to bring good out of it. And I think as an architect and as people who care about culture, one of the things that we do care about is the public realm, buildings and cities and the architecture of those cities. It's true, we need to bring back a literacy and understanding of architecture, of traditional architecture, which you could say we've forgotten or we've been poorly taught in recent decades, but that the common man has inherently an appreciation for. They're not offended by a classical building. They don't find them ugly in most cases. If they're a great classical building, they often love them, whether it's the US Capitol or the White House or their local courthouse. They're often seen with appreciation, respect, maybe even reverence. And so other architecture draws on that. So I think it is a great chance to reconsider what the buildings of our society, of our republic, of our church, of our government can be. And I think as you said earlier, and as Alex said, this idea of solidity, this idea of permanence, the pest or the plague is all about it's death, and it's also chaos and confusion, and it's fear. So architecturally, artistically, we want to bring back harmony and hope. And what better way to do that than with beautiful buildings and elevating artwork?
Is there a living tradition in the United States of erecting sacred architecture that has a kind of memorial purpose, be it for an epidemic? I don't know if there are any such churches in the United States today, or war, where I think you can find themes incorporated. How living and vital a tradition does that remain?
Yes, that's an excellent point. Memorials for wars or epidemics, and how living is it? And again, I would argue that it's in our human psyche that we actually do appreciate things that are beautiful, symmetrical, monumental. And then if we bring to that our education and culture and Western civilization, we have an even richer appreciation for those things. And this is a very good topic for today, because in the last, well, really since we built the Vietnam Memorial in DC, there has been this outpouring of interest in building memorials and monuments. So we had this war, we were conflicted over it, and later on, we thought in the early mid 80s, we thought one way to do this was to memorialize the 50,000 soldiers who died, which was great. But anyway, what that did is that inspired a whole bunch of other movements for other Vietnam memorials and then other memorials. And then finally, it's kind of shocking that we built the Vietnam Memorial before we built the World War II Memorial, which just happened 10 years ago. And now they're working on a World War I Memorial. So for some reason, we didn't feel the need to build a very grand memorial to those wars. We have things in DC that are in honor of them. We have buildings in honor of them. We have battleships and airplanes in honor of these wars. And certainly we have statues of the great generals and so on. Iwo Jima is perhaps the famous monument to World War II. But it is in style in the US, certainly in our nation's capital. And one of the debates that has been out under recent discussion for federal buildings is what should our federal city look like, or what our federal buildings look like no matter where they are, wherever they're in Chicago or San Francisco. Should there be a federal presence, and is the classical tradition a way of doing that, or should at least be allowed, which many people in my profession don't think it should be allowed. So I think it's a very timely topic. The churches is another thing, and that's very interesting too. I think there is a lot there that religious bodies actually have been pretty good over time in memorializing events, whether it is wars or pestilences or other catastrophes. And I think it's part of the religious impulse to celebrate, but also to memorialize too, and not to hide from death, to admit death, to be sad, and sadness is okay, and mourning is actually a good thing.
I'm just going to indulge myself in one additional question. What do you think of the World Trade Tower that was built on the site of the 9/11 disaster? What do you think of that as memorial architecture?
Well, it's tall and it's striking, and it's built near the site of the original tower. So in that sense, I guess it's a statement of, we can keep going. The thing I find, at the time, I remember thinking, well, this is a good reason not to build tall towers, But I think there's the other kind of macho response to terrorism, which is, well, they destroyed our towers, but we'll rebuild them. And I understand that. But I think, really like the World Trade Center, the Empire State Building, these buildings, the Sears Tower in Chicago, these buildings are more about bravura than they are about use. And there's nothing on the inside that's particularly good for humans or for public use. They're kind of seen from afar as a monument. And financially, they haven't been particularly good buildings. They tend to not fill up. But I think the 9/11 memorial in the base of the tower is interesting because it was consciously designed as two holes, like the square plans of the memorials, two holes in the ground, and the theory or the theme was absence. And I think that's a very sad way to memorialize a couple thousand people who died in really the worst catastrophe on our soil. So I think that was a very unfortunate memorial. It has to be big, has to be grand, but it's kind of meaningless. And that's kind of where much of modernism is today. Modernist memorials it's really hard to know how to represent anything because they don't believe in the figure, and their architecture is abstract, and maybe they believe in what the architect has to say. But I think that the World Trade Center is 1,776 feet tall. Like so what? Like, okay. But that's about it for what the architect could come up with. And this is a very famous, brilliant architect. So I think it's very difficult when you eschew the history of architecture, or you eschew Western civilization before 1920. It's hard to do architecture that resonates and that's profound. You can do something functional. You can do something that is new and glitzy, but it's hard to do something that has longevity and power and presence. And that's really what memorials need. Memorials, churches, museums, courthouses, city halls need that. They need to be more timeless, whereas perhaps the office building or the hotel can be, glitzy and new, and then we tear it down after 20 years.
Alex?
Well, one question that kind of I'm wondering about is we think of, I mean, we look at the history of Europe and we've seen some really large scale epidemic, like the Black Death and so forth, which had just devastating impacts on the entire European population. And many historians have talked about the various social and historical ramifications and changes as a result of these kinds of events. I'm curious if you think that in your field of sacred architecture, do we see changes in the way sacred architecture is done as a result of these kinds of plague? I mean, it seems to be a practice after a plague to build churches, and I'm just curious, some sort of from an aesthetic and design aspect, if we see impacts of the plague itself on the aesthetic, or do they stick with it tried and true for this?
Yeah, it's a great topic, and it's of course gotten us. We're interested in it at this time with the coronavirus, which has closed down the world in major part, at any rate. And so, what have we done in the past, and how have we dealt with things in the past architecturally? And again, I'm always looking for, like, how can I, as an architect, do something good, or how can I promote something good? And it is fascinating that you might say out of evil has come good. Some of our greatest, or many beautiful things have been done in response to devastation and death. And so, like you say, the Black Death was a horrible thing, the Black Plague. And a city like Venice, because it was kind of this, meeting point of the world, and ships arriving from all over the world, unfortunately had more of these plagues and more experience with the plagues than other cities. And of course, they invented the word quarantine, 40 days, because that was the time that we needed to move those people that were sick away from others. And so Venice is really interesting because they had a number of responses. Of course, you build hospitals, you build homes for quarantine, for kind of permanent quarantine of people, whether it's leprosy or plague. And those, because it's Venice, they end up being on islands. So you take an island and you make it a place for the plague victims. Well, that keeps the rest of the city pretty safe from them, or fairly separate. I mean, we're worried about social distancing. They had water, now we still take care of these people. We send doctors and nurses, and there's food and so on. But it's interesting that they built these little villages or little monasteries on islands called Lazaretti. And I believe that's after Lazarus, who died and was brought back to life by Christ. So the Lazaretti is one response. The hospitals is another response. But then there are five major churches in Venice, some of which are famous, that were all built by, you might say, the city of Venice in honor of a plague, in thanks for the plague ending. And they all have this theme. They're not really a church that we need to serve this neighborhood. They're really built to thank God. So it's kind of a throwaway. It's kind of like buying your wife a beautiful necklace. She doesn't need it. But we want to give it to her. And so it's, I think it's that kind of idea of thanks, of a gift, and they call them votive churches. But these plague churches, there's 5 of them in Venice. And it's really fascinating that they would do that. The other example I like to use is Milan, with St. Charles Borromeo, who was the archbishop and kind of ran the city during the plague, 1575. And he actually began designing the Thanksgiving church before the plague was over. He knew that it was going to be over. He knew that God was going to answer his prayers, and they were going to try to practice proper hygiene and all these things, and eventually would. So he already was building a church. In that case, it was to Saint Sebastian, the saint that people have seen the paintings of, the early Christian martyr who was shot with arrows. And so that was seen as, if you pull an arrow out of yourself, that reminds people of the pustules or the bumps on your body that look like the plague. But at any rate, this idea that we build a church in thanksgiving for the ending of the plague, and of course we're praying that Saint Sebastian and Christ will prevent us from having another plague.
Miles?
You mentioned saints. Consistently certain saints that people would come back to over and over during these kinds of plagues, or is what we find sort of the local, like each area has sort of their local saint that they go to during plague? I'm just curious about that, because I imagine that prayers for being saved from plagues would have been very common historically. So I'm just curious, what would be the most common saints to turn to in those?
Yes. No, this is something I'm really fascinated by, Alex, and I think there is a lot of regionalism here, because if there is a local saint for our region of France or our region of Italy or Spain, then we're going to be particularly connected to them like we would to a family member or somebody in our nation's history. But there are some, I think, some common people that we ask for help. And of course, first, of course, is God himself and the Trinity. And we see the Trinity, the kind of the main emphasis of the monuments in Austria and in the Austro-Hungarian Empire. They built monuments to the Trinity. And of course, there'd be other saints in these monuments. Then, of course, the Madonna and Child, which is in Western Christianity and continues in, Orthodoxy and Catholicism. Great place, a person that we ask for help because she's connected to her son, and so we believe that she has a special strength or special ability to pray for us. You could say, Mother of God, could you pray for us? So the Madonna is the other one, and perhaps the greatest church in Venice is the Madonna della Salute, which is built by the city after the plague of 1630. So Christ, the Trinity, and then the other saints that are interesting to me is there is this new Saint Corona that I shouldn't say new, this new Saint Corona that people are praying to, because she has the right name. But the other saints that are kind of famous are, interestingly, the Old Testament saint, the Old Testament father who was so stricken himself by his family dying, his animals dying, his servants dying, is Job. And the first plague church in Venice was actually built in the 1400s to Saint Job, or Jobe, as they say. And the Doge, or the Duke, had it built, and it was the ending of the plague, and they wanted to, isn't that interesting, an Old Testament saint, this great, and in fact, other people told me that the way they really get through hardship is by reading the book of Job. So he's somebody who, for no reason was stricken, and God did it to show what a man of faith he was, not because he deserved some punishment. So Job is interesting, other Old Testament saints, and then Saint Rocco, who healed people during his life, and then after he was dead, his body was brought around in Venice, and was given credit for ending the plague in Venice. So even his body after death. And then who's the third one? Rocco. Oh, Saint Sebastian we talked about before. So I think those are the biggies. Old Testament Job, Saint Sebastian, early Christian, later Saint Rocco or Saint Roach, and then Our Lady and Christ the Redeemer, or the Trinity. So it's kind of interesting. And then the variety of ways that you would express that architecturally. I do believe that these churches are all unique. They're all classical, by talented architects with amazing artwork, and yet they're very different. And we can also see some continuities between them, and that's fascinating.
Miles?
Well, that's really timely, because I was just about to ask about the issues that have been raised about processions, and the idea, I guess, informally of comfort coming from liturgy in general and architecture in particular. Professor Stroik, it's interesting, you mentioned a couple of the saints that are appealed to in times of plague. And as a vernacular development, actually a liturgy has been put together. You can find it on Twitter under the user No True Scotist. And it's a long, long litany of saints. It includes Mary as Salus Populi Romani, which you mentioned, Saints Roch, Saint Benno, Saint Adrian, Saint Sebastian, Pope Sixtus II, and Albertus Magnus, the sort of the great patron saint of science in some ways. But it's a kind of vernacular and portable response. And what's interesting is not only are there no masses now, the churches are physically closed. So the processions that you began by mentioning are somewhat closer to where the response is now, because people can't access or take advantage of the architecture in full. One thing I was going to ask you about was this kind of meeting of top-down architecture and bottom-up vernacular and the idea of comfort. Before the current pandemic struck, I was reminded of the image by Roger van der Weyden, the altarpiece in which he has the 7 sacraments. And there's this really comforting image of someone in a bed receiving viaticum, I guess, and also extreme unction in the church. And in the neighborhood where I live in Toronto, it's Parkdale, the nearest church is the Oratory in Toronto. It has a little bit of the architecture that you see behind you right now. It's kind of Palladian and spare. So in a sense, it's symmetrical, as you say, old-fashioned, you might say tutelary, but people instinctively flock to it. People who are not necessarily churched or churchgoers will come in off the streets for refuge, not from plague, but just from the fact that the neighborhood is scabrous, noisy, and in unrest all the time. So there's a lot of tumult in people's lives, and the church is a place of comfort and refuge. And of course, there they can see some beautiful works of art, and they're in a place where light and sound and calm are carefully modulated. They don't necessarily have to be literate in Palladian architecture, but it's something that answers an expression that comes up spontaneously. So in the neighborhood I live in now that I mentioned, I see stencil art on the street with the Virgin Mary saying "Ora pro nobis." So there's this kind of popular demand, and I guess I'm wondering, even though what you represent is a kind of traditional, formal, disciplined, and schooled kind of art, is there a way in which it speaks to a vernacular appetite in our time for comfort?
Yes. And this is comfort in the sense of we need comfort, we need to be, we need help, we need healing, rather than comfort of luxurious comfort. Yeah, no, I totally agree. And I think that one of the things that over the centuries, the church has certainly done some of the greatest high style, or been the patron of some of the greatest high style art, music, architecture, painting, sculpture, etc. Yet I think that part, if not all of it, was always intended to reach the vernacular, always intended to reach the common man. And when it's good and when the people are allowed to, I think it does, people appreciate it. And that's very exciting, because something could be elite. We think today so much about the elite arts, certainly the Modern Art Museum, the average person doesn't want to go to. Certain kinds of modern composers in the symphony, the average person doesn't go to. But the intention I think, of classical art and architecture is that it can speak at different levels. Can it speak to the educated, and it can speak to the common man. And so your examples of people chalking on the sidewalk or pro nobis is very exciting, that the people, it's coming out of the people, their response, what they want. And the people often know, I would say the people often know best. It may not be as intellectual, may be missing some things, but the people often have a very positive, very thoughtful response to these terrors. The examples of the churches I'm using, most of them in Venice, Milan, etc., have works of art that were very beloved by the populace. in times before they were, you could say, canonized by the art historians and turned tourist attractions. They really were attractions for the common person. And so your point about these prayers to the different saints was very much what the person in these cities would go to say a little prayer or gaze at the saint and ask for their help, whether it's time of plague or not. We have never worried about plague in our time. 1918 maybe is the last one, but we have these other things, and we do have problems. And so I think this is an awareness now for us to appreciate that, but it is really for the whole populace, the church, the unchurched. That's what I want to do at any rate. I don't want to do something just for a small group or just for the elites.
Another example of the populace and churches that occurs to me in recent times was what was happening in Notre Dame, right? We think of Paris, many people might think of Paris as one of the more secularized cities, but had all those crowds gathering outside of Notre Dame during the fire, and singing Marian hymns and this sort of thing. So, I mean, I think that sort of shows how powerful the role, even in contemporary times, which we think of as very secularized, the prospect of losing or having that church damaged, what it brought out in the people of France and Paris. One question would be, what role did churches play? I mean, talk a little bit about plague churches. What role did churches play during the plagues themselves? I mean, were people brought into the churches at that time? I mean, what sort of things would tend to go on during epidemic? I also thought it was very interesting that you mentioned Job, because one of the things that I would think about is that historically people might think of plagues as a divine punishment, and I'm sure that played a role. But the case of Job is the case of the righteous.
Excellent.
Which is something that I think is quite interesting, and raising the whole, these profound theological questions about why the innocent suffer and this sort of thing. So I'm just curious what.
Yeah, I'm glad you brought that up, Alex, because that is, I think, historically and even today, holy people or people of faith assume that catastrophes of some sorts or certain kinds of events have something to do with us, and that we in some way need to learn from them, or maybe we deserve them or punishment. I think that's common. I think even Pope Francis has kind of hinted at, that our mistreatment of the environment is bearing fruit, and we need to do a better job taking care of the environment. So I think that's a common view, and I know some people that have that view right now. And Job is a nice tonic to that, is a balance to that we can still learn from it, but perhaps there is no necessarily punishment or what have you. And then your question was about, it was very good.
Just about what role did churches physically play during plagues? Did they?
Yeah. So
were they basically just for prayers and masses, or were there hospitals set up in your church? You see what I'm saying? That sort of.
Yes, that was an excellent point, and I think this connects us back to what, for most of us today, might remember. It's the closest to us is 2001, 9/11. The bombing of the World Trade Center. That's probably the thing that's closest. The country shut down, airlines shut down for a couple days or week, and we were all in mourning. We were all in shock. Our great city was destroyed, or part of it was, and people were dying or dead. It was a pandemic, as it were. It was a pandemonium. So we can relate to that, and I think that there is an analogy here in the sense that when things are tough, people do get religion. Or when things are tough, people are looking for solace or looking for comfort, as Miles said. And one of the places you might turn is to faith or religion or beauty, or, so as another kind of medicine, spiritual medicine. So that was certainly true after 9/11, that people ran to the churches, people went to church, people went back to church. remember reading people that were about to get divorced, put the divorce off. You know, it forced people to rethink their lives and in a more profound way. And I think it, at least generally in a positive way. So I think that's our natural response. And if we are homo religiosos, then even modern people want to do something. And we want to go to the churches, or we want to go to a special place or a sacred place. And where I teach at Notre Dame, we have a grotto with candles. People go there to pray and light a candle. So I think there is this desire to have a response. The monuments that people put on the sides of the road where a loved one was killed in a car accident, the monuments that were put on the Vietnam Memorial or at the fences along where the World Trade Center was destroyed. Again, this kind of popular response, wanting to do something, wanting to go somewhere. The church architecture is part of that. And during the pandemics in the past, I think it really varies. But I think before the idea of quarantine, you went to church. Of course, that's what you need. People are sick, so we go and pray. Once the idea of quarantine comes, we realize, well, maybe, you know, this person, that person's sick, so we need to keep them in their house and not let them out, or even bring them to the island where the other people that are sick and they can be taken care of and not infect the rest of the city. So that kind of evolves. And then finally, this idea that we're living under right now, which is the idea that it's so bad that we need to close the churches. And there are examples of that, but I haven't really been able to track down the facts on that. It's really interesting. Maybe you all have. But I read about the churches being closed, but for how long? What have you read, Alex, on this?
No, I was actually curious about that myself. I mean, I haven't found any example so far, but I haven't done, you know, profound research on it. I mean, part of it, I imagine, is that knowledge of microbes is relatively recent, right? So it may be, if we're going to look for examples, they would have to be, you know, sort of 19th, 20th century, but I'm not aware. I'm not aware of it.
I've recently had the, I don't know if it's a pleasure, but interesting experience of reading Daniel Defoe's Journal of the Plague Year, which is a slightly fictionalized account. He was only 5 years old at the time, so he had to draw on other sources, including an uncle who had left a fairly detailed journal of his own experience during the plague. And he does remark on the fact that the churches stayed open. Now, people were sufficiently aware of the contagion. They weren't quite sure how it worked, but they were sufficiently aware of the plague's contagion to practice social distancing. People, for example, walked down the middle of the streets so that they wouldn't accidentally encounter at close quarters someone leaving a house. So the churches remained open. They weren't as, the number of attendees was reduced in part because a lot of people either had fled town or were quarantined in their homes, but they did remain open. Some of the ministers fled, but when that happened, what often occurred was it was right after the Restoration, and a lot of the independent and Congregationalist ministers were removed from their churches after the king came back. So when the official priest at an Anglican church fled, he often was replaced without any authority, but in point of fact, by one of these deposed ministers who stayed in town. So the churches did operate, and no doubt were an important source of comfort. Which leads me to ask whether this is also a tradition in Protestant churches. The new St. Paul's was erected because of the fire that followed the plague, was erected not long after the plague. I know it contains World War II memorials. Does it, or do other Protestant churches reflect these kinds of catastrophes if they were built at about the same moment or right after?
I'm sure they do, Steve. I think all cultures, Protestant, Catholic, Orthodox, non-Christian cultures have all memorialized these events. And whether it's in the city square or on the building or in the building. And I think that's what's interesting is that religious communities, even though there might be a World War II memorial in the city square, they'll also have a memorial in the church as well. And so I'm sure that they do have memorials like that to different plagues in England, but I'm not aware of, which ones.
May I ask a question? Oh, sorry, please.
Go ahead.
No,
Go ahead,
I wanted to
Alex.
ask a question about a design element that I found of interest, that was of interest to me. In your article for First Things, you mentioned Saint Sebastian, and you mentioned that Saint Charles Borromeo was not, as is sometimes thought, sort of an enemy of the cylindrical design. It mentioned also, if I recall correctly, that it had Doric columns and this sort of thing. Okay, why does this interest me? Well, I mean, he's thought of as a figure of the Counter-Reformation, which is often thought of as sort of this turning back on the quote-unquote paganism of the Renaissance with its glorification of all things Greco-Roman and classical. I haven't found that in the domain of letters, right? So, for example, the Ratio Studiorum of the Jesuits is all about reading Virgil and Ovid and Aristotle and Plato and all. I mean, it was largely taking up a humanist curriculum. But it was curious to me that it seemed like perhaps there's a bit of a misnomer there as well at the level of architecture, that classical forms were still to some degree esteemed during the Counter-Reformation. Is that a fair characterization? Or perhaps you can, or you know far more about this than I do. So is there anything you could expand on that point? A classical motif in Counter-Reformation churches?
Yeah, no, that's an excellent point. The way I see the Counter-Reformation is a continuity with the Renaissance, and you could say an enriching or a emphasis, or there's a greater passion, or a new style. And obviously there are things that the Counter-Reformation artists and architects are interested in dealing with, like the emphasis on the Eucharist or the Blessed Sacrament, which was now under debate in the world, but wasn't in 1500, or was a very tiny debate. So there is that. And the circular form for a church is kind of fascinating because we've had them since the earliest baptistries, let's say the baptistry of Constantine around 330 or something, 315 in Rome. We've had round or octagonal baptistries, but the Renaissance really revived them in a big way for other kinds of churches. And of course, one of them that we think of, and I think it's fair to say, is a centralized church in honor of Christ, the Redeemer, a church in honor of the Virgin, the Mother, and then various special saints. One of them is Sebastian. One of them would be San Rocco. The plague saints are often in circular or octagonal or oval churches. Now, one argument could be they didn't need to be that big, these little plague churches, or they're a hospital church. I'm thinking of some hospital churches in Florence that are dedicated to Rocco or to Sebastian. And so they don't have to be huge like a parish church or a monastic church. But one of the things that I've found in Venice is that there's an interest in having domes in these plague churches. They all seem to have domes, and the domes are over the altar. And there are other churches that do that as well, but it's fairly unique. So this light coming down upon the altar, and the dome is not at the center of the church. The dome is at the end of the church. And then, the end of the nave, you have the dome, and then you have the altar under it. And, or like you brought up, St. Sebastian, which is a circular church, the altar is right outside of the circle or under its own dome. So I think there are a couple of things that are of interest here: circular, octagonal, centralized churches, or domes over the altars. And then, of course, the actual iconography, the actual altar pieces. In Venice, the great painter Veronese, his parish church was St. Sebastian, and he did almost all of the paintings in there, including this majestic altarpiece of St. Sebastian being shot with arrows, tied to a column, but he's praying to the Virgin. So the idea is we come and pray to St. Sebastian, and he's talking to the Virgin. Virgin's holding God in her lap. So it's that idea that our prayers going up to heaven, majestic painting, and then Veronese actually gets buried there.
Very interesting. San Roque, or Saint Roch, has come up a lot. He happens to be in Santiago de Compostela. It's actually a feast day that's commemorated by the whole town. That there's, it's like an official feast day kind of thing for the city. So I'll have to look in now to the history. It got me interested in that. If there was a plague or at some point or something like that, why would that be?
Right.
Very, very interesting.
Right.
Professor Stroik, do you
It's a
expect
fascinating part of our history.
do you expect to see the current pandemic memorialized in church architecture as we go forward?
That's a great question. I don't know. I'm not really a prophet, but I hope that we will find some good things to do from this shutdown and this. I suppose there are good things about it for academics. We're getting our books written, and other people are spending more time with their families. There's all kinds of good things about it. But I hope that there's some positive art and architecture that comes out of it. What we've been discussing today, just the appreciation for our history and for some of these cities and buildings. I think I have a greater appreciation that I didn't have before for the plague or the pandemic, and why Santa Maria Salute in Venice was built, or this amazing Trinity column, the Pest Sala in Vienna was built. I saw it. I thought it was majestic. I thought it was a knockout. It's all gold leaf with 25 cherubs and saints and angels on it, and the Trinity at the top. I hope that people will have a greater appreciation for our history and these great works of art, and why they come out of pain. They come out of suffering. And you could say, well, if we have pain and suffering, now the thing to do is to take our money and have better hospitals, or spend it on the economy, or have a bigger house and a bigger yard, so when the next one comes, we're protected. Or maybe we should have a chapel in our home, or we need to have better TV and a Zoom internet service. But I hope that also people will say, out of this pain and suffering, let's do something beautiful for society and for mankind and for God.
Well, I'm sure you will be part of that. Thank you very much for sharing your perspectives with us.
It's great to be here, Steve. And thanks to Alex and Miles and everybody for talking about the plague churches and classical architecture in our time of Corona.
Everybody stay well.
You too.
Bye-bye.
Well, thank you.
Yeah, thanks a lot.
Thanks, Miles. Thanks, Alex. Great job.